I'm going to start from the beginning, even though you probably already know how the story ends. Most people do by now. His face is on commemorative plates in 3 star systems. There's a mural of him on the outer wall of Varath Station that stretches 40 meters. I've seen children on Korath VII wearing shirts with his image on them. Children who have never set foot on Earth, who have never even seen a human in person, and they know his name. But I knew him before any of that. I knew him when he was just a man who showed up at the wrong wedding and refused to back out of it. So let me start there. Let me start with the truth, because the statues and the murals don't tell you the truth. They tell you the legend. And the legend is real. I'm not disputing that. But the legend doesn't tell you what it felt like to stand next to him in the middle of it. The legend doesn't tell you about the way he hummed old Earth songs off-key when he was nervous. It doesn't tell you that he kept a battered notebook in his chest pocket everywhere he went, not for tactical notes, but for sketches. Flowers, mostly. Little architectural details he found interesting. Faces. That notebook is sitting on my desk right now. I'll get to that part. Part 1, the arrangement. My mother's name was Celia Voss. She was a mid-level trade attaché for the Earth Diplomatic Corps, stationed at Confederation Hub Theta 9, which most people just called the Wheel because of how it looked from the outside. A massive rotating ring station orbiting a dim red star about 40 light-years from Earth. The Wheel was, at the time, the primary trade junction between the Earth Federation and the Varath Confederation, which was then the most powerful multi-species alliance in our region of the galaxy. I grew up on that station. I want you to understand what that means. I grew up in corridors that smelled like recycled oxygen and spiced oil from the Korath food stalls on level 8. I grew up watching Varath diplomats in their layered ceremonial silks walking past Earth engineers in grease-stained coveralls. I grew up knowing how to say thank you in 4 languages before I could ride a bicycle, and I never learned to ride a bicycle well, because the station's lowest gravity sections made it nearly impossible to balance properly. What I'm telling you is that I was not naive. I was not a sheltered girl who didn't understand the world. I knew how diplomacy worked. I knew that agreements between species were built on trust, and that trust was built on gestures, and that gestures sometimes cost something. I knew all of that. I still wasn't prepared when my mother sat me down at 18 and told me about the arrangement. The Varath Confederation had been negotiating a joint military protection treaty with the Earth Federation for 2 years. It was stalling. The Varath High Council didn't fully trust human military forces. They saw us as too aggressive, too emotionally volatile, too unpredictable. There was a phrase they used in their internal documents, which my mother had seen translated copies of. They called humans the burning species, not as a compliment. The treaty needed a confidence-building measure, something symbolic but real. The Varath had a tradition, centuries old, of binding important alliances through what they called Kethforin, a joining of households. Not a political arrangement, not a formal ceremony between diplomats, but a genuine marriage between individuals from the respective parties. The thinking was ancient and very Varath. You don't truly trust someone until one of yours sleeps in their home. The Earth Federation's diplomatic team proposed a modified version. Not a Varath joining. They knew the full ritual would be unacceptable to Earth's public. But a formal marriage between a human officer and a civilian member of the diplomatic community, conducted under a treaty framework that would serve as a symbolic gesture of commitment. The human officer they selected was Captain Davin Orinda, 7th Marine Expeditionary Force, Earth Federation Navy. He was 26. He had volunteered, or so I was told later, though the word volunteered carries complicated weight when the request comes from a superior officer with treaty implications hanging over the conversation. My mother selected me. She didn't ask, she told me. And she did it with such practiced diplomatic composure that it took me almost an hour of sitting alone in my small quarters, staring at the station's recycled air ceiling, before the full weight of it settled on me. I was 18. I was going to marry a stranger. I met Davin Orinda for the first time on a Thursday, station time, 6 weeks before the ceremony. My mother arranged a formal introduction in one of the Wheel's diplomatic reception rooms. The room was designed to impress. Curved walls of dark synthetic wood, light panels set to a warm amber that softened everything. A long table with refreshments from 4 different culinary traditions, arranged with careful intentionality. He was already there when I walked in. He was taller than I expected. Dark-haired with the kind of build that came from years of military conditioning, broad shoulders, precise posture, but his face was younger than I'd prepared myself for. He looked like someone who'd been told to look older and hadn't quite managed it. He was standing near the window port, looking out at the Red Star, and when I came in, he turned immediately. He didn't salute, he said, "Hi." Not "Good morning, Miss Voss." Not a formal greeting. Just "hi," like we were 2 people who'd been seated next to each other on a transport and were going to be stuck together for a few hours. I said hello. He said, "I'm sorry about all of this." That was the first thing that surprised me. Not the apology itself. I'd half expected something like it, some careful diplomatic expression of regret, but the way he said it. No rehearsed quality, no careful calculation in his eyes. He just looked at me with something that was plainly, obviously genuine discomfort and said he was sorry and meant it. I told him I understood the situation. He said, "Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's comfortable. You're 18, I'm 26, you don't know me." He paused. "I just want you to know that I'm not going to make this harder than it has to be. For you, I'll follow your lead on everything." My mother was sitting at the table, watching this exchange with the careful, neutral expression of someone who was recording every micro-expression for later analysis. I looked at Davin Orinda, this stranger who was going to be my husband in 6 weeks, and I thought, he's as uncomfortable as I am. That shouldn't have been comforting. It wasn't exactly, but it was something. We sat down and had tea. Or rather, I had tea, and he had something that was technically a Korath spice drink because, he admitted quietly, he'd made a bet with someone in his unit that he could drink anything the station offered without making a face, and he'd been working his way through the menu for 3 months. "How's that going?" I asked. "I made a face at the Zeth mineral broth," he said. "Just a small one, but it counted." That was the first time I laughed. It was the smallest possible thing. But I've thought about that moment a lot over the years, about how much a small laugh can do when you're sitting across from a stranger who's going to legally become your family. We were married 7 weeks later in a ceremony that was simultaneously a formal Earth Federation event, a diplomatic treaty milestone, and for the Verath delegation present, a Kethforan acknowledgement. 3 ceremonies layered over each other. My mother looked like she'd engineered a perfect machine. The Verath High Representative, a tall, silver-skinned being named Coordinator Yeth, watched with polite satisfaction. I wore a dress that my mother had selected. It was white and formal and perfectly correct. Davin wore his dress uniform. He looked, to be entirely objective about it, very good in dress uniform. He also looked slightly pale, and when we were standing together just before the formal processional, he glanced at me sideways and said, very quietly, "I'm going to step on your foot. I always step on someone's foot at formal events. I'm warning you in advance." I whispered back, "I'll move out of the way." "Probably won't matter," he said. "It's instinctive." He didn't step on my foot, but I spent the first half of the ceremony paying attention to foot placement instead of the words being spoken, and I think that's probably why I didn't cry, which I'd been worried I might. After the ceremony, during the reception, I watched him talk to people. He was a Marine officer, and Marine officers at diplomatic events are often slightly out of their element, and some of them handle it by getting stiff and formal and retreating into professional distance. Davin didn't do that. He stood in corners and listened to people. He asked questions. I watched a Verath junior cultural attaché talk to him for 20 minutes about architectural traditions on the Verath homeworld, and Davin's attention was completely, genuinely held. He pulled out that battered notebook and asked if he could sketch something she was describing, a traditional lattice structure used in ceremonial buildings, and she looked startled and then deeply pleased. My mother appeared at my elbow and said, very softly, "He's good at this." I said, "He's not performing it." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "No, he isn't." We set up a shared quarters arrangement on the wheel for the first 2 months. It was a small space, 2 rooms and a common area, and we were in it together more than either of us had expected because his assignment, pending the treaty's formal ratification, was to the diplomatic security detail on station. Those 2 months were the strangest of my life, and also, in retrospect, some of the most important. We were strangers learning to share a small space. We were careful with each other in the way people are careful with unfamiliar tools they might break if they press too hard. We had a system for the kitchen. I cooked on even-numbered days, he cooked on odd, and on days when either of us had had a hard shift, the other one didn't comment on the quality of the result. We had an unspoken agreement about noise. He woke early, I slept late, and he learned to move through the quarters without making sounds, which, for a Marine who'd spent years in heavy tactical boots, was apparently a significant effort. I learned things about him the way you learn things about anyone you live alongside. Not from conversations, though we had those, but from observations. The way he started every morning by doing push-ups in the common area, exactly 47, never more, never less. The way he read actual physical books, real paper books that he'd brought in a small case from Earth, dog-eared and annotated. The way he talked to himself sometimes while he was making food, not loudly, just small murmurs, like he was running through a checklist in his head. The notebook was always in his chest pocket. Always. On duty, off duty, in the middle of the night if he got up for water. One evening I found a page of it open on the common area table. He'd left it there, not hidden, just set down while he'd gone to answer a comm, and I saw that it was covered in very careful, very small sketches of the wheel's architecture. The curved corridor junctions, the light panels, a detailed rendering of the exterior portside docking array as seen from the observation deck. They were genuinely beautiful, not technically perfect. He'd be the first to say he wasn't a trained artist, but they had this quality of looking, of real observation that made them feel alive. I didn't mention it when he came back, but I thought about it. The treaty ratified in month 3. Captain Orinda's posting was reassigned. The 7th Marine Expeditionary Force had a new deployment, and he was expected to rejoin his unit. The diplomatic arrangement had never specified a duration. It was a genuine marriage, not a contract, and its terms were deliberately vague because the Earth Federation's legal team had wanted flexibility. In practice, it meant that Davin was leaving, and the shape of our arrangement was going to change into something neither of us had specifically discussed. The night before he shipped out, we sat in the common area after dinner. I'd cooked. His last even-numbered day was tomorrow, but I'd cooked anyway, because I'd found a recipe for something close to a dish he'd mentioned his grandmother made, and I'd spent 3 hours getting it approximately right. He ate the whole thing and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "That's the best thing anyone's made for me in 2 years." I said, "It's not perfect." He said, "It doesn't have to be." We sat for a while after that, not talking. The station hummed around us, the constant low frequency that you stopped hearing after the first month, but that was always there if you thought to listen for it. He said eventually, "I want to be honest with you." I said I was listening. He said, "I didn't volunteer for this. I said yes, but it was made clear that yes was the right answer. I want you to know I know that, and I know that this whole situation hasn't been fair to you, and I'm not going to pretend it has been." He paused. "I also want you to know that these 2 months have been," he stopped again, seemed to be choosing words carefully. I'm glad I know you, even with all the mess of how it started. I'm glad I know you. I looked at my hands. I said, I'm going to be honest too. He waited. I said I was angry about this for a long time before we met, and for the first few weeks after, I felt like I'd been arranged, like furniture. I looked up. I don't feel like that anymore. You didn't do anything to make me feel like that. And I think I'm going to be worried about you when you're deployed. I think that's going to be strange. He said, you can calm me whenever, even if it's just to talk about nothing. You'll be in the field. I'll find time. He meant it. I could tell. That was the thing about Davin. When he said he meant something, you could feel that he meant it, like there was no gap between the words and the intention behind them. It wasn't a common quality. I'd grown up in a diplomatic environment where words and intentions were professionally separated. He left the next morning. I stood in the docking bay and watched his transport pull away, and I did not cry, but it was a near thing. Part 2, the field. He calmed me 7 days after deployment. I was in my mother's office going over some minor administrative work. My own diplomatic training had begun, formally, after the ratification, and the calm alert came through on my personal unit. I stepped into the corridor to take it. His face on the screen was slightly blurred from signal compression, and there was background noise behind him, low, constant, the sound of military equipment and movement, but his expression was clear. He looked tired. He looked like himself. He said, "Hi, is this a bad time?" I said, "No, are you all right?" He said, "Yeah, fine, boring transit jump, I thought I'd check in." A pause. "How's the station?" We talked for 11 minutes about nothing in particular. The new food vendor that had opened on level 6. A Verath cultural exhibit that had been installed near the diplomatic wing. The novel he'd left behind by accident that I'd found on the shelf and had been reading. He said, "Oh, that's a good one. Don't read ahead of chapter 18. I said I was already on 22. He said, "Oh no. It's fine." "It is absolutely not fine. Chapter 22 is," he stopped, seemed to notice something behind the screen. "I have to go, my sergeant is giving me the look." I said, "The look?" "Marines have a look, it means wrap it up, Orinda, very eloquent." He looked back at me. "I'll come again when I can." He ended the transmission. I stood in the corridor for a moment with the screen dark, and I was smiling, and I was not entirely sure when that had started. The 7th Marine Expeditionary Force was deployed to the Harran Corridor, a region of contested space, about 12 light-years from the Verath Confederation's outer territories, where a faction called the Rikthari Collective had been staging increasingly aggressive resource extraction operations. The Rikthari were not a major power. They were more accurately described as a well-armed opportunist collective, a loose confederation of species who decided that the most efficient way to acquire resources was to take them from less defended sources. The Earth Federation had treaty obligations to protect Confederation shipping lanes in that region. The 7th MEF was there to fulfill those obligations. I knew this in the abstract. What I didn't know, what I couldn't know from the wheel, was what it actually looked like. Davin's comms came irregularly, sometimes 3 in a week, sometimes once in 3 weeks. They were never long, and he was always careful about operational security. He didn't tell me specifics of what they were doing, where they were, what engagements had occurred. But I could read the edges of what he wasn't saying. I could hear the quality of his voice, the particular kind of tired that came through when something had gone badly, the particular kind of carefully neutral tone he used when he was processing something he wasn't going to talk about yet. I was, officially, a civilian spouse of an active duty officer with no security clearance. I got sanitized reports and official casualty notifications if applicable. I became very good at reading between lines. 4 months into the deployment, one of his comms came through at an odd hour, very early station morning, which meant it was in the middle of whatever passed for daytime on the ship he was stationed on, so he'd found a deliberate window. He looked different, not injured. I checked for that first immediately before anything else, but something had happened, and whatever it was sat on him visibly, like a weight settled across his shoulders. He said, "I want to talk about something, not tactical stuff, just," he paused, "you know the notebook." I said I did. He said, "I've been sketching faces, people on the ship, I do it in the off hours." Another pause. "I was thinking about what you said about furniture, about feeling arranged. And I've been thinking, everyone here, they're all arranged in a way. Nobody picked their specific posting. Nobody picked the particular set of people they're going to be in combat with. And then something happens and you look at those people and there." He stopped. I waited. He said quietly, "We lost someone last week. Good person. Sergeant Yima Delacroix. She'd been with the 7th for 4 years. I drew her face about a month ago just in a bored moment and I went back to the sketch," and he shook his head. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." I said, "Because you needed to tell someone." He said, "Yeah." We didn't talk much after that. He said he needed to get back. I said, "Be careful." And I meant it with a force that surprised me. A force that had been building for 4 months of reading between lines and checking the casualty notification feeds and learning to sleep through the worry. He said, "Always." I didn't sleep after that calm. Month 7, a report came through official channels, the kind that didn't name names but used unit designations, about an engagement in the Harran corridor. A Rikthari raiding force had hit a Verath civilian convoy, 3 transport ships carrying agricultural equipment, and about 400 civilian workers from a Verath colony to an Outer Rim station. Standard piracy and extraction approach. Overwhelm with numbers, board the ships, take the cargo and whatever else they wanted. The 7th MEF had intercepted. What the official report said, in its careful bureaucratic language, the engagement resulted in the successful protection of all civilian transport vessels and their passengers. Earth Federation Marine Corps personnel demonstrated exceptional tactical response in a situation of significant numerical disadvantage. Casualty figures for EF personnel are classified at current time. The engagement is designated mission success. What I understood reading between those lines, they were outnumbered, it had been bad, and they'd done it anyway. Davin's comm came 5 days after the official report. He looked tired in a different way than I'd seen before, the kind of tired that went beyond the body. He said, "You probably saw something in the feeds." I said I did. He said, "Everyone made it. Our people," he said it like he was still slightly surprised by it. "We had casualties, some people are hurt, a few serious, but everyone made it back." I said, "Are you hurt?" He said, "Some, nothing, it's being dealt with." He paused. "The Verath ships, there were families on one of them, I didn't know that until after. Colony workers, and some of them had brought family because the transit was going to take them close to a major station and they were going to visit." He looked at something off screen. There was a kid, little one, maybe 4 years old. They let us onto the civilian ship after to do a welfare check. And this kid she came running over and grabbed my leg. He smiled, briefly, tiredly. She didn't speak standard. Just grabbed my leg and wouldn't let go. I said, "That sounds about right." He said, "The Verath crew were watching me. They had this, I don't know how to describe their expressions, like they were recalibrating something." I said quietly, "Because you saved them." He said, "We saved them, the whole unit." I said, "I know, but you were there." He looked at me through the screen for a moment and then he said, "I miss the station. I miss the smell of the Korath spice stalls. I miss—" He stopped. "I'm going to be home in 3 months." I said, "I know." He said, "I think about that a lot." He came back 9 months and 22 days after he'd shipped out. I didn't know the exact arrival time. Troop transports didn't broadcast schedules for security reasons. But I knew the approximate window, and I was in the docking bay when the transport came in, standing with a small group of other civilian spouses and family members who'd also done their math and shown up early. He came through the docking gate in his field kit, carrying a single bag, looking like he'd lost weight and gained something harder to name. He saw me before I saw him. I was watching the wrong gate, and I knew because he called my name. I turned. He was walking toward me. And then we were standing in front of each other, and I didn't know what to do with my hands or my face or any of it, because 9 months is a long time, and I'd thought about this moment, and it was different from what I'd imagined. He was different. I was different. We were both looking at each other doing the arithmetic of time. He said hi. I said hi. And then I did something I hadn't planned to do. I stepped forward and put my arms around him, and he put his bag down and put his arms around me, and we stood like that for a moment in the docking bay while other people moved around us. He said into my hair very quietly, "It's good to be home." I said, "You're here." That was all. Part 3: The Chain. The 3 months he spent on the wheel after that first deployment were different from the first 2 months of our arrangement. We were not strangers anymore, but we were also not quite what we might have been if we'd had a different beginning, if we'd met ordinarily, chosen each other freely, built something from a foundation of our own making. We were something in between. We were 2 people who had been arranged into each other's lives, and had, in the process of that arrangement, discovered that they genuinely liked each other, which is a different thing from love, and which might become love given time, but which existed on its own terms and didn't need to be defined further to be real. He settled back into the quarters easily, easier than I expected, as if he'd been finding his way back to it in his head during the months away. He brought his bag and unpacked it with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. He put the notebook on the shelf by the window port. The first week he slept a lot, long, heavy sleeps that I didn't disturb, that he came out of slowly and seemed almost apologetic about. I told him not to be. He said he wasn't used to safe sleep, the kind where you didn't have to keep one part of your brain monitoring. I didn't ask what that meant. I understood what it meant. By the second week, he was up at his regular time, doing his push-ups, making food on odd-numbered days, reading his physical books. But there were differences. He watched the station differently, with a tactical attention he hadn't had before, always noting exits and sightlines, which is a habit that Marines apparently develop and don't entirely shed. He was quieter in crowds, though he recovered from it quickly and was still the person who'd stand in a corner and genuinely listen to a Verath attaché talk about architecture for 20 minutes. He told me about things gradually. Not everything and not all at once, but the way you open a window a little at a time when you've been in a closed room. He told me about the Heron corridor engagement, more than the official report, the actual texture of it. He told me about Sergeant Yima Delacroix and about the others in his unit, their names and their quirks and the specific ways they were remarkable. He told me about the Verath ship they'd boarded after, the little girl who'd grabbed his leg, the way the Verath crew had looked at him. I told him things too, about my diplomatic training, about a complicated mediation exercise I'd been involved in, a junior role, observational mostly, but real, about a conversation I'd had with Coordinator Yeth, who was, beneath the formal Verath manner, genuinely funny in a dry, very alien way. We built something in those 3 months. I don't have a precise word for it. Something that fit between the words we had available for it. Then his next deployment came. I'm going to skip forward now, because the next 4 years, told in detail, would take longer than this archive has room for, and also because they are mine, in a way that the later parts aren't. They're our private thing, the texture of a life being built in the gaps between deployments, The comms and the returns and the slow accumulation of a shared language that people develop when they spend enough time being honest with each other. What I'll tell you is the shape of it. He deployed twice more in those 4 years, both to the Haran Corridor region as the situation with the Rikthari Collective escalated. He was promoted to major after the second deployment, on the basis of commendations that came through official channels, and which I read with a mix of pride and the particular terror that comes from understanding exactly what exceptional tactical response means in practice. He came back each time. He always came back with more sketches in the notebook. I completed my diplomatic training and took a junior posting on the wheel, cultural liaison mostly, working with the Varath delegation on joint cultural exchange programming. It was small work, but I was good at it. Davin told me once, watching me come home from a particularly difficult negotiation session looking wrung out but satisfied, "You're going to be exactly like your mother in 10 years. I said, "Is that good?" He said, "Your mother is terrifying and also brilliant, so yes." I threw a cushion at him. He caught it without looking up from his book. At the end of year 4, something shifted. The Earth Federation Military Command had been watching the situation in a different region, a sector called the Vethian Reach, which bordered the Varath Confederation on the opposite side from the Haran Corridor. 3 species with overlapping territorial claims, all of them well armed, all of them looking for an incident that would justify escalation. The kind of powder keg arrangement that took one miscommunication to detonate. The Federation had been sending military observers to the region, people who could assess the situation without being perceived as a military buildup. It was the kind of work that required a particular combination of skills, military training, tactical awareness, and the ability to actually talk to alien species without triggering defensive responses. Major Davin Orinda was selected. He was not deployed as part of a unit this time. He was sent alone, with a small support staff, to serve as the Earth Federation's military observer and de facto liaison to the 3 species in the Vethian Reach dispute. The assignment was for 18 months. I remember the night he told me. We were sitting in the common area. He'd cooked, a new recipe he'd been experimenting with, and he said it simply and directly, the way he always said difficult things, because he believed that the kindest form of hard news was clear news. I sat with it for a moment. Then I said, "You're going alone." He said, "I have support staff, but yes, essentially." I said, "And you're supposed to manage relationships with 3 species who are one bad moment away from a shooting war." He said, "That's the broad strokes, yes." I said, "I'm coming with you." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's not how the assignment." I said, "I'm a credentialed cultural liaison with 4 years of experience working with the Varath Confederation. The Vethian Reach has Varath-adjacent population groups. My access, my language skills, and my existing relationships within the Confederation diplomatic structure are assets that the assignment needs." I looked at him. "I'm not being emotional, I'm being practical, and I'm right." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You've been thinking about this since before I told you." I said, "I saw the assignment recommendation 3 weeks ago. I've been building the case." He said slowly, "Your mother is terrifying and brilliant, and so are you." 3 weeks later, we shipped out together. Part 4, The Reach. The Vethian Reach was nothing like the Wheel. The Wheel was a built thing, a station of human and Varath engineering, optimized for diplomacy and trade, everything smooth and deliberate. The Reach was organic chaos, 3 inhabited systems with populations that had been in proximity for generations, without ever quite resolving into cooperation. The Shetvar, an insectoid species with a rigid caste system, and a deeply held conviction that territorial boundaries were sacred unto death. The Mir, fluid atmospheric beings who experienced physical space very differently from solids-based species, and whose territorial claims were expressed in terms that didn't translate well into most diplomatic frameworks. And the door, large reptilians with a strict honor culture and a hair-trigger sensitivity to any perceived slight. 3 species, overlapping claims, and 1 human major and his civilian liaison wife supposed to keep the whole thing from exploding. I want to say that it was immediately clear that Davin would be extraordinary at this, but that would be rewriting memory. The first month was painful. He tried conventional military diplomatic approaches, structured meetings, formal agendas, written statements of principle. The HFY responded to formal process, but the mirror found the concept of sitting in a fixed location for a meeting deeply bizarre, and the door refused to enter a meeting room where the HFY were already present because the HFY's designated representative outranked door counterpart in a way that, in door honor culture, meant the door would have been entering a subordinate position. The meetings kept breaking down. He came back to our quarters on the station above Vethian 3, a small Federation outpost, barely the size of a large house, looking exhausted and frustrated in a way he'd never quite looked during combat deployments. Combat, I'd understood, was something he was trained for. This was something else. He sat at the table and opened the notebook and just drew for a while, not talking. I made tea and left him to it. After about an hour, he looked up and said, "I'm thinking about this wrong." I waited. He said, "The structure is the problem. I keep trying to create a framework and bring them into it, but the framework itself is the obstacle." He paused. "The door said something to me today through the translator that I keep turning over." He said, roughly, "The translation's not perfect. You speak to us like a functionary. Like I'm a mechanism delivering process, not a person engaging with them." I said, "Are you?" He thought about it. He said, "Yes, I think I am." He closed the notebook. He said, "What would happen if I just went to them? Not with an agenda, not with a formal meeting request. Just went." I said, "The HFY would be deeply confused and possibly offended." He said, "Not the HFY, the door. I think the door are the key. Their honor culture means they respond to personal directness. Functionary doesn't work, person might." I said, "Going to a door elder unannounced without a formal introduction request could also be perceived as a significant insult." He said, "I know. That's the risk." He looked at me. I said, "Go." I didn't go with him. That part was important. It needed to be him, alone, one person approaching another without the apparatus of diplomacy. He went to the door settlement on the surface of Vethian 3. No formal request. No translator system, just a small personal unit for real-time translation. No guards, no aid. He went and he knocked, or the door equivalent of knocking, and he asked to speak with Elder Varshet, who was the door's primary voice in the territorial dispute. The elder came out and looked at him for a long moment. Through the translator, the elder said, "You are the human officer." Davin said, "Yes, I wanted to speak with you directly." "Without the meetings." The elder said, "Why?" Davin said, "Because the meetings aren't working. And I think it's because I've been treating this like a process problem when it's actually a relationship problem. And you can't build a relationship through a formal agenda." The elder was silent. Davin said, "I brought something." He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out the notebook. He opened it and showed the elder a page. "I drew your settlement from the observation deck yesterday. I wanted you to know that I was actually looking at it." I got this account from Davin later that night, after he came back. But I've heard the elder's version too. The door keep detailed oral records, and an account of this meeting circulates in their community to this day. What the elder saw, apparently, was a human officer standing at his door with no weapons, no guards, no formal apparatus, holding out a book with a sketch of his home in it. The elder took the book and looked at it. The sketch was accurate. Small, careful, made with the intention of someone who was trying to see, not just observe. The elder invited Davin inside. They talked for 3 hours. When Davin came back to the outpost, he was tired but different. The good different, the kind I'd come to recognize as the aftermath of something that had actually worked. He said, he told me what the HFY did in the 3rd season of the Vethian dry year 40 years ago. The border incursion that they've never acknowledged. Nobody in the formal record mentions it because the HFY controlled the documentation around it, but the door remember. I said, that changes the territorial dispute framing. He said completely, the door aren't just claiming territory, they're trying to get acknowledgement of something that was taken from them without any formal recognition of the wrong. He sat down. That's not a territorial negotiation problem, it's a historical justice problem, and those need completely different tools. I said, I can reach the Confederation Historical Archive through my diplomatic access. The Verath Confederation had observers in the Reach during that period. They might have independent records. He said, can you? I said, I already sent the request. When you told me you were going to see the elder, I looked at him. I knew if it worked, we'd need the documentation. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, we're good at this. I said, together we are. Part 5, The Legend. The next 8 months in the Vethian Reach are documented in Federation records, in Door oral history, in HFY formal archive, and in a somewhat startled mirror cultural memory cloud that I'll explain in a moment. I'll give you the version I saw. Davin's approach, after the meeting with Elder Varshet, completely restructured. He stopped trying to bring the 3 species into a shared framework. Instead, he went at each of them separately, repeatedly, consistently, with no agenda except attention. He went to the HFY caste councils in their formal structure, because that was how the HFY communicated respect, and he learned the precise etiquette of their greeting rituals and performed them correctly. He continued meeting with the Door through Elder Varshet, and the meetings became something like friendship, not identical to human friendship, but something with warmth in it. And the mirror were the strangest challenge, because meeting with a fluid atmospheric being whose concept of presence was entirely different from a solid-bodied species required a completely different approach. What he eventually did with the mirror was this. He asked to enter their atmospheric space. Not in a suit. The mirror's atmosphere was breathable for humans for short periods, thin, slightly sweet-smelling, not optimal but survivable. He asked Elder Varshet, who had contacts in the mirror community, to arrange an introduction. And then he asked the mirror contact, a being whose closest translation name meant something like third current, whether he could simply be present in their space. Not talk, not negotiate, just be present. The mirror experience of communication was based on shared physical presence in atmospheric current, not on language. Language, for them, was a secondary tool for communicating with outsiders. Real communication was presence. He sat in their atmospheric space for 2 hours. He didn't try to talk. He just sat and breathed their air and existed in their presence. I was watching through the observation window of the airlock, my heart in my throat, because this was not a medically approved approach, and he'd had a 10-minute argument with the station's medical officer before the medical officer had reluctantly cleared it. Afterward, Third Current communicated something to the translator AI that it took the AI 3 attempts to render in standard. The best translation it eventually produced was, "This one brings his whole self." I've thought about that translation a lot. I've thought about what it meant that a species whose entire mode of communication was about authentic presence looked at Davin Orinda, and that was what they said. The resolution of the Vethian Reach dispute took 11 months. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers, the way real things happen. a HFY acknowledgement of the historical record that Davin and I had sourced from the Verath archive, drafted carefully with input from HFY cast protocol specialists over 6 weeks. A renegotiated boundary framework that used mere atmospheric boundary concepts rather than solid-line territorial markers, which the mirror found actually comprehensible, and which the door, unexpectedly, found acceptable because Elder Varshet had explained to his council that the human officer had presented the approach as honoring the nature of each party rather than imposing a foreign structure. It wasn't clean, diplomacy never is, there were setbacks. There was a 4-day period in month 8 where the entire agreement nearly collapsed over a secondary territorial point, and Davin and I sat in the outpost for 48 hours straight working through it, running on terrible synthesized coffee and stubbornness. He said, at about 3 in the morning of the second night, looking at the wall of documents we'd spread across every available surface, "I think I need to go back to Elder Varshet." I said, "It's 3 in the morning." He said, "Door don't have the same night cycle restrictions, and this particular problem is a door problem." He looked at me. "You should sleep." I said, "Absolutely not." He sighed. He knew I was right. We both went. Elder Varshet opened his door at 3 in the morning, station time, which the door tolerated as a framework while finding it somewhat arbitrary, and looked at the two of us standing there in the dark, both exhausted and slightly frantic around the edges. He said through the translator, "Come in." We sat in his receiving room. He made something warm to drink that tasted like bark and smoke and was actually very good. He listened to the problem. Then he said to Davin, "You are worried that they will walk away." Davin said, "Yes." The elder said, "Do you believe the HFY elders are acting in bad faith?" Davin thought about it carefully. He said, "No. I think they're genuinely concerned about the secondary boundary, and they're not going to sign something that doesn't address it." The elder said, "Then you already know what to do. You go to them and you say, 'I hear that you are genuinely concerned. Tell me what you actually need. Not what you've put in the document, what you actually need.'" Davin was quiet for a moment. He said, "I've been treating it like a negotiation problem when it's still a relationship problem." The elder looked at him with what I'd come to recognize as the door equivalent of patient affection. He said, "You will forget this lesson several more times before it stays." Davin looked at him. Then he smiled, this real, unguarded, slightly tired smile that I don't think the elder had seen from him before. He said, "Am I that obvious?" The elder said, "No, but I have known many young officers. You all forget the same thing. Then you remember it, and that is when you become something more than an officer." The agreement was signed on a morning when all 3 of the Reach's inhabited planets were in visible alignment from the Vethian 3 observation deck, a coincidence that nobody had planned for, but which the door, the HFY, and even the mirror in their own way took as significant. Davin stood in the signing room, which had been designed, per his specifications, as a neutral space incorporating architectural elements from each of the 3 species traditions, a detail that had taken 3 months to get right and which every commentator who later wrote about the agreement mentioned, and he watched the 3 parties make their marks. I was standing to one side. The room was full of formal witnesses, Federation observers, Confederation diplomatic representatives. It was crowded and significant and historic. Davin looked at me across the room. I don't know what my face was doing. Whatever it was, he saw it, and he gave me the smallest possible nod, just a slight dip of his head, the way he nodded when something he'd been working on finally clicked into place. I nodded back. The agreement was signed. The reports that went back to the Federation, to the Confederation, and to the Galactic news networks were thorough, enthusiastic. The phrase that appeared most often was unprecedented. The outcome of the Vethian Reach dispute had been categorized, before this mission, as optimistic unlikely by 3 separate Federation analytical bodies. The resolution had taken 11 months. The previous most successful attempt at Reach mediation had taken 7 years and ended in partial agreement. Within 6 weeks, Major Davin Orinda's name was in every significant diplomatic and military news outlet in the region. Within 3 months, he'd been promoted to lieutenant commander and offered a senior posting at Federation Diplomatic Command. Within a year, the Vethian Reach Agreement was being studied in military academies, diplomatic schools, and cross-cultural relations programs in 11 species educational systems. Elder Varshet gave an interview to a Galactic Historical Society journalist that was later reproduced in approximately 40 languages. He was asked what he attributed the success of the negotiations to. He said, and I'm translating from Door here, which always loses something, the human officer did not pretend to be without feeling. Other diplomats pretend. He did not. He came to us as a person and he spoke to us as people. This is rare. This is, I think, rare among any species. When I read that interview, I was sitting in a transit hub on my way back to a posting I'd taken at the Confederation diplomatic offices on Vareth Prime. I read it twice, and then I put the screen down, and I looked out the transit hub window at the stars. I thought about the man who'd said hi to me in a diplomatic reception room when he could have said something formal and safe. I thought about the battered notebook with flowers and architecture and faces of people he wanted to remember. I thought about him sitting in the thin air of mere atmospheric space for 2 hours just being present, because that was what they needed. This one brings his whole self. Part 6, what came after? He was promoted to commander the following year. The assignments that came after the Reach were bigger, more complex, more demanding. The galaxy, it turned out, had no shortage of situations that needed someone who could walk into a room full of different species, all on the edge of doing something catastrophic, and make them feel heard. I was with him for most of them. My own career had developed in parallel. I'd moved from junior cultural liaison to a mid-level position at the Confederation diplomatic offices, and my work in the Reach had given me access and credibility that opened doors I hadn't expected. I was not, let me be clear, just Davin's spouse trailing behind him. I had my own work, my own cases, my own relationships, my own small and large contributions to the agreements and understandings that came out of those years. But we worked together on the big ones. There was the Shedi Passage crisis, 3 months of brutal back and forth between 2 species with a 400-year grudge, and Davin's particular role was to convince the military commanders on both sides that the scenario they were about to enter would result in mutual annihilation, a fact that both sides already knew rationally but were too pride-locked to step back from. He spent a week just talking to commanders, not negotiating, talking. Hearing their histories, their grievances, the specific weight of what they felt they were carrying. And then, at the right moment, he told them what he'd seen in the Heron Corridor, what it looked like when people died for territory that nobody ultimately got, what the cost of that kind of math actually was. He told it plainly, without performance, the way he told me things in the early morning when he was thinking out loud. The commanders listened. The Shedi Passage standoff was resolved without a single shot fired. He was given the Confederation's Vethian Peace Medal for that one. He put it in a drawer. He was genuinely, slightly embarrassed by awards. I had to make him go to the formal ceremony. There was the Korath exclusion situation, a bureaucratic nightmare that was going to result in about 40,000 Korath workers being stranded outside their home system due to a treaty technicality, and which Davin had technically nothing to do with except that he'd heard about it from me and spent 6 weeks finding a legal argument within the existing treaty framework that resolved it. Not his jurisdiction, not his job. He did it anyway, submitted it to the relevant authorities through the appropriate channels, and the problem was fixed. 40,000 people went home. He didn't tell anyone. I found out because one of the Korath diplomatic liaisons contacted me to thank someone, and the trail led back to Davin's off-hours legal research. I asked him about it. He said it was a solvable problem. I said it wasn't your problem. He said sure, but I could solve it. That was the thing about him. That was the thing that the statues and the commemorative plates in the 40-meter mural don't quite capture. It wasn't that he was brave in the dramatic, visible sense. Though he was, I've seen that. I have been in rooms where the situation was genuinely dangerous and watched him not flinch. It was that he was constitutionally incapable of walking past a solvable problem and leaving it unsolved just because solving it wasn't his assigned job. The little girl who grabbed his leg on the Varath civilian ship. The door elder who'd never been seen by a human as a person, rather than a party to a dispute. The 40,000 Korath workers who never knew his name. He just kept doing it, over and over, quietly, persistently, with that notebook always in his chest pocket and that habit of really looking at everything around him. We had a home eventually. It wasn't on the wheel. We'd both moved on from there. But it was a proper home, a set of quarters on Varath Prime that we'd chosen together and made into something that reflected both of us. His books on the shelves, my diplomatic documents in neat stacks on the desk, his sketches on the walls, not the notebook pages but larger versions he'd made over the years, some of them framed by me without telling him and hung up before he could object. The notebook sat on a particular shelf where he could always find it, cycling through the dozens of filled volumes he'd accumulated over the years when the current one was full. 11 years of the notebook, 11 years of faces and flowers and architectural details, and the small, beautiful things he noticed everywhere he went. We had dinner parties, something that still felt slightly improbable to me, that we'd become the kind of people who hosted dinner parties, and the guest lists were a remarkable thing to stand back and look at. Varath cultural attachés and human engineers, and a Dor historian who was Elder Varshet's granddaughter, who was studying at the Confederation University on Varath Prime, and who called Davin uncle in the doorway that signified a specific kind of respectful affection. One of his former Marine unit members who'd come to work in private security, and who still called him sir even when they were eating dinner at our table, and Davin was telling him to stop. A mere atmospheric philosopher who communicated through a translation box, and who found dinner party conversation confusing, but seemed to find the experience of being included meaningful. One evening, after a dinner party, after everyone had gone and we were cleaning up together in the quiet, I said to him, "Do you know what Elder Varshet's granddaughter told me tonight?" He said, I said, "She said her grandfather talks about you, to his students, to people in the community. He tells them about the human officer who came to his door in the middle of the night with a sketch of his home." Davin was quiet for a moment. He said, "I still think about him." I said, "He's still alive, you could calm him." He said, "I do sometimes. He's very old now. He tells me I'm still forgetting the lesson." He smiled. I think he's right. I looked at him. This person I'd been assigned to marry when I was 18. This man I'd been afraid of in the abstract before I knew him, and had subsequently spent 11 years discovering in detail. And I thought about all the distance between arranged furniture and where we'd actually ended up. I said, "You know, I've been thinking about something." He said, I said, "That first day, when you said hi to me instead of giving me a proper diplomatic greeting." He turned to look at me. I said, "Why did you do that? You were a Marine officer. You'd been briefed on diplomatic protocol. You knew the correct greeting." He thought about it. He said, "You looked scared." Not obviously, you were composed, you were doing everything right, but you looked scared underneath it. And I thought, if I walk in there with a formal diplomatic greeting, I'm going to be one more piece of the machinery that's making you scared. He paused. I just wanted you to know there was a person in the room. I looked at him. He said, also I was terrified, and informal felt easier. I laughed. He said both things were true. I picked up a glass to put away and then set it back down. I said, I want you to know something, not for the record, not for any diplomatic purpose, just as the person who's known you for 11 years. He waited. I said, I am deeply glad that it was you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have been from the beginning, I have been. He stopped. He looked at me with that same directness he'd always had, that lack of gap between words and intention. He said, from the very beginning, Cale, from that very first day. I just didn't have the right to say it yet. I said, you have the right now. He said, I know. We finished cleaning up, and then we stood in our kitchen in our home on Verath Prime with the alien stars visible through the window port, and there was nothing more that needed to be said right then. I want to tell you about one more thing, the thing that became, in the galactic record, the defining moment. 3 years ago, the Galactic Sovereignty Summit on Korath Station, a multi-species assembly that was, as these things always are, an enormous undertaking of logistics and egos and carefully managed competing interests. 42 species represented. The agenda was the formalization of a mutual defense framework that had been in negotiation for 9 years. And on the third day, something happened that nobody had planned for. A faction within one of the species' delegations, I'm not going to name them because the political situation is still sensitive, had decided that they didn't want the framework to succeed, and they had arranged for a demonstration. Specifically, they had arranged for a group of armed extremists to stage an incident in the main assembly hall during the plenary session. I was in the hall. Most of the 42 delegations were in the hall. Commander Davin Orinda was there as part of the Earth Federation security complement. What happened next was recorded from 14 different angles, because the summit had comprehensive security coverage, and those recordings have been reviewed approximately 1,000 times by everyone from military analysts to historians to documentary filmmakers. The extremist group entered through a secondary access point that they'd gotten access to through internal compromise. They were armed. Their intent, established afterward from intercepted communications, was to take the hall hostage and force a halt to the framework negotiations by demonstrating that the signatory species couldn't even guarantee each other's safety in a summit hall. What they did not account for was that Davin had been watching the access points. Not because he'd been briefed on the specific threat, he hadn't, because that was what he did. He watched rooms. He noticed exits and sightlines. He had been doing this since the first deployment, since that first return to the wheel when I'd noticed him doing it and understood what it meant. He saw the access point open before anyone else did. What happened in the next 4 minutes has been analyzed and reanalyzed. I'm not going to give you the tactical breakdown. You can find that in 12 different academic papers. I'm going to tell you what I saw. I saw Davin move before anyone else in the room had processed what was happening, not toward safety, toward the delegates. He moved through the hall, quickly, precisely, without drawing attention to the access point and the people coming through it, because drawing attention in that moment would have caused panic, and panic was the second worst outcome available. And he went to the section of the hall where 3 specific delegations were seated, delegations that he had identified, apparently in about 2 seconds, as the most likely targets. He put himself between those delegations and the access point. And then he did something that took exactly everyone in that hall by surprise. He didn't draw his weapon. There were now 6 armed individuals in the doorway of the secondary access, and they were looking at the hall with the flat assessment of people who had committed to something violent. And Davin was standing between them and the delegates, and he didn't draw his weapon. He held up his hands, and he talked to them. I know how this sounds. I know what the military analysts said afterward, that it was either the most calculated tactical decision he could have made or the single most reckless thing they'd seen in a summit security context. The reality, which he explained to me afterward, was that it was both. He talked to them for 6 minutes and 43 seconds. This is timed from the security recording. In those 6 minutes and 43 seconds, he used everything he had, every door concept of honor and direct engagement, every Verath diplomatic phrase, every HFY formality he'd learned, and beneath all of it just plain human speech, directed at people who were afraid and angry and committed to a course they hadn't fully thought through. He asked one of them their name. I watched. On the security feed they showed us in the locked-down side room where the delegates had been moved, as one of the 6 armed individuals looked at this human officer with his hands up, who was asking him his name, and I watched the individual answer. Later, much later, that individual said, in a formal statement, that no one in his life had asked for his name at a moment when he held power over them. He said that the human officer had done it without calculation, without strategy visible in it, just as if names mattered because people mattered. The 6 minutes and 43 seconds ended when the summit's dedicated response team came through the main access points. By then, 2 of the 6 individuals had already lowered their weapons. Nobody died. Nobody was seriously hurt. The framework negotiations resumed the following day. 6 weeks later, the Galactic Mutual Defense Framework was signed. I've sat with this story for 3 years now, trying to figure out how to tell it correctly. The part that the accounts always miss, the part that gets lost in the legend of it. He came back to our temporary quarters on Korath Station that night, after the debriefs, after the medical checks, after the formal commendations that he accepted with the same slightly uncomfortable expression he always had for awards. He came in and he sat down at the table, and he pulled out the notebook. I sat down across from him, and I didn't say anything for a while. He drew for about 20 minutes, then he turned the notebook around. He'd drawn the hall, the assembly hall from memory with all its architectural details, the specific curve of the ceiling, the arrangement of the delegation seating. And in the middle of it, very small 2 figures, one standing with hands raised, one in a doorway. Just 2 small figures in a large hall. I looked at it. He said, I keep thinking about his name. I said, what was it? He said, Riveth. He said the name carefully like it mattered. His name was Riveth. He looked at the sketch. He's in custody now. There'll be a formal process. He paused. He was 22. He'd been told a story about what this framework would do to his people that wasn't true. He'd made a choice based on a false picture. He looked up. I keep wondering who told him that story, who put him in that room. I said, that's not your problem to solve. He said, no, a beat, yes. I looked at him. He said, not in the immediate sense. But someone taught that kid to be afraid enough to pick up a weapon. That's a solvable problem at the root of it. Education, access, true information instead of, he stopped. He shook his head. I know that's not my jurisdiction. I said, when has that stopped you? He looked at me. I said, the Korath exclusion issue wasn't your jurisdiction either. He was quiet. I said, do what you're going to do, I'll help. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over mine. He said, you know what I think about sometimes. I waited. He said, that first day, the way you were just there, trying to be composed in an impossible situation, and I thought this person is being so careful and so brave and they shouldn't have to be. He paused. I think about how different everything would have been if you hadn't been there, in the reach, in everything after. He paused again. You're the reason half of what worked. I said, that's not true. He said, it's absolutely true. You knew when to talk and when to wait. You understood things about the Verath diplomatic culture that I didn't. You ran the historical research that unlocked the door's trust. He looked at me. I'm the one who got the mural. You're the one who made the mural possible. I said, I don't want a mural. He said, good, neither do I, but I want you to know. He squeezed my hand. I want you to know that I know.